So today we are beginning a series of conversations on the art of translation in the RACC Movable Studio in dialogue with masters of the ancient art of translation as they reflect on their work. What is translation after all? What is the nature and the role of the original, quote unquote, in each particular case? And what is actually being translated? And why is it relevant now of all times? So my first guest is Dmitri Manin, who is a physicist, programmer, and translator of poetry. His translations from English and French into Russian have appeared in several book collections. His latest work is a complete translation of Ted Hughes's Crow, Yaromir Khladik Press, 2020, and Allen Ginsberg's The Howl, Kaddish and Other Poems, Подписные издания, 2021. Dmitri's Russian to English translations have been published in journals, Cardinal Points, Delos, The Cafe Reviews, Metamorphoses, etc., and in Maria Stepanova's The Voice Over, 2021. In 2017, his translation of a poem by Stepanova won the Compass Award competition. Dmitri Manin, welcome to the Movable Studio of RACC.
Thank you. I'm really very much honored by this invitation, and I'm looking forward to talking to you.
Same here.
I'm sure that you're going to get very different answers from different translators to the questions you posed. So it is something that does warrant talking to different people. At least for that.
Yes, it's our description. That would be our permanent description until we decide to change it. And yes, we will. It's a very tentative plan, and we'll see how it all unfolds. But since we just mentioned the Compass Award competition, let's start with this. We met. Mitya, I will call you Mitya because this is
absolutely that's my preferred.
We met in 2017 when I think you participated for the first time in our Compass translation competition and immediately won the first prize. It was a very memorable season because it was the last season of Compass. And also it was the first and thus the only time when the poet translated was a living poet. So I'd like to ask you a few questions about that. But first I want just to explain to the listeners that how it was done. There was a jury, there was a board the jury board that consisted of prominent translators and scholars, both native Russian speakers and native English speakers. And it was just blind judging, the board of judges rather, right? And it was blind judging, just very simple points that would be arithmetically combined. And the winner would be determined just by computation of votes. And this is how it was all done. Nobody, including myself, never knew who the authors were behind the translations. And so you won the first prize translating Maria Stepanova's poem Saturday and Sunday Burning, right?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And this is not an easy, as all Stepanova's poems, this is not an easy poem to translate. Could you please tell us a little bit about this, a few words?
It's a poem that kind of encapsulates the stuff that I like about poetry. it is ostensibly about something very simple and visible, but starting with from that starting point, the poet goes into excursions both in the semantic space, if you will, both in the meaning space and in the linguistic space. Maybe it's easier if I just read it. I was going to read another one, but since we're starting talking about it. Saturday and Sunday burn like stars, elder trees foam and fizz. By the railroad crossing's striped bars, a communal wall hollers. Past it are slabs like canvases dank in the dark, and the moon cherry, and tiny, tightly packed crosses, a darned soccer cross-stitch embroidery. Yellow dogs pass here at an easy trot, and grandmas come to comb sand. Giant women grind their temples into the rock, wailing and threshing to no end. But these are times indistinguishable like stumps, like my pair of knees. At the sun one stares, in the shade the other one slumps. Both are dust and ashes. But these are nights when the nettle folk stands guard among the pickets here, and the gentle May enters his peaceful orchard, raining a tear. And between hand and hand, between day and night, there is unpersonal, brightly burning, eternal quiet. It is formally very interesting. Both rhymed and kind of loose in the contemporary way, which allows you to, which on the one hand satisfies my love for the form, and on the other hand allows kind of an easy smuggling of rhyme into contemporary English language poetry, right? So that's kind of why I chose it. It jumped out of me from the page as something that I wanted to translate, and I thought it had a chance to be appreciated in translation.
Yes, it's a wonderful translation, and you hear this very Stepanovian combination of those needs, right? The material, very vivid blob objects and images, and at the same time the constant sense and presence of the universe. And all the transient things, and the actually, speaking of transit, the changing lines, the changing line lengths, right? In the original, you dealt with very interestingly, and rhyming, which is both very seemingly almost plain and at the same time unpredictable.
With those knees, what's interesting is that it is similar to what Zabolotsky has. It is a simile in the reverse direction. It compares something very abstract to something very concrete rather than the other way around, right? Or maybe I'm wrong. Maybe it's the regular way.
But speaking of Zabolotsky, you since you mentioned Zabolotsky, you have a volume coming out soon, or relatively soon.
Yeah, relatively soon by the book publishing standards next year.
This is momentarily.
Yeah, it will be if it happens, of course, you can never be sure of anything that's going to happen in a year. But if it does happen, it will be my first book of translations into English, and I'm very thrilled, excited.
We all are
about that.
in anticipation of that. Because, so, Mitya, how did it all start? How did it happen that you started translating poetry? I know, and now our listeners know, that you are a physicist and programmer, and I know something about your family history and its connection with literature. Can you talk a little bit about this, and or whatever you want to talk about, and also who your mentors were, if you had mentors, in fact, because I think in this art, I see this art as a almost Renaissance workshop where masters work side by side with apprentices and disciples. So who were your mentors, if you had any?
So my story is not interesting at all. I'm a very dull person. Nothing interesting happens to me ever. But my first translation happened at school. Our English teacher, who was a very, very eccentric and weird, but very kind and nice woman, once gave us a homework to translate into Russian a poem by Longfellow. Something about the arrow that the poet sent out into the world, and then he sent out a poem into the world, and who knows where it went. You need to pick it apart in order to create something that would not just be similar in appearance, but would also work the same way. And it so happened that I stumbled upon a virtual translation seminar workshop led by Evgeny Vitkovsky, the translator whom Gasparov called the best poetry translator of our time, or something like that. And it was a game changer for me because first, what I did was more or less accepted as being satisfactory quality. And second, people worked there. It was a very practical arrangement. It wasn't just a place where people came to discuss things. They worked on books. They translated poetry, which then was published as books. And I asked if I could try participating in one of them. And that's how it all started, because that was an amazing school and crash course, boot camp, if you will. Vitkovsky always said that he can't teach anyone how to translate. He can only show what not to do. And so you got all these little nudges every time you tried to veer off course, to do something that is not a good practice. And then, of course, another important component is that Vitkovsky kind of watched all this from above, but then a relatively small but active group of excellent translators, excellent poetry translators, critiqued each other's work. And the ethos of this community was such that you could do honest critique without fear of offending some, the person you're critiquing. It's the ideal case, it's the ideal environment where it is understood firmly that what is being critiqued is the work, not a person. It's all trivial, but it's not. It's very hard to implement all those rules, simple and effective rules, in practice. Vitkovsky's workshop is the only place I know of. Well, no, since then I learned about another one, but where it was implemented and it worked like charm. I've translated thousands of lines of poetry while being there, and participated in several books, and it was a very happy and fruitful process.
Was it Vitkovsky who introduced this idea of that you mentioned earlier of the original being taken apart like a clock into, because this image that you mentioned, it surprised me because it's to me it stands somewhere in the middle of this road, of this distance rather, between the so-called original and the person who is aspiring to rework it in a different medium, in a different language completely. And one may be reluctant to take apart and just do it as a completely new variations, just looking at the whole gestalt of the thing, the whole, as the poem as a whole. Or on the other extreme, which is very interesting to me personally, I'm not a prolific translator, but I'm somewhat minor practicing translator, is the annihilation of the complete thing. In other words, I thought we would talk about it a little bit later if we were to talk about it anyway, but since you mentioned that, I can't help asking, but ask about this role of the original. So we can remember Brock in his diary said that in order to own the thing before you paint it, you have to annihilate it first. So what is original? Is it some kind of, is it a solid object in a way? Or it's something like in Solaris, the film, when Harry is suddenly frozen and then she unfreezes, right? And then she lives a completely different life. So how many Harrys are there? How many originals do we have? Is it just, I once thought that of the original as a cloud, a three-dimensional object that is sort of stable, although meteorologically it's not possible, but let's just for the sake of the argument, it's something stable. And then it casts shadows on the terrain of different texture and relief, right? And topography. And these terrains or translators rework this cloud in their own way, and they're all different. So there is this multiplicity of versions, but there is one original. Then I thought that maybe the cloud itself is not the kind of firstborn, right? It's also a stage in the succession of some prior original, be it an idea, speaking of Mallarmé that you translated, or Zoom reminds me that we may need to restart at some point. Or in Hopkins, an entirely different perspective, when the thing itself, or the poem itself, or the thing itself, a bluebell itself, is the thing, not the idea of a thing, but the thing itself. So there are different ways to approach it, and the clock is a very powerful, I think, device and very powerful paradigm, but maybe not the only one. So what do you think? If we run out of time, I would need to resend the link.
So I'm a very simple-minded person, and I have an analytical mind. And I'm not a poet myself. Maybe the reason that I like translating poetry is that I always wanted to do poetry, but I cannot do it myself. I don't have anything to say. So, to me, a poem exists in two important planes, if you will. Let's step back a little. I like the structuralist worldview, which says that the relationships, connections between things are more important than the things themselves, in a way. A poem has internal structure, that is, connections between different words and ideas that are mentioned in it. The rhyme, for example, is a very simple type of internal structure. Rhyme is a connection between two words. Syntax is a trivial example of connection. Right? And then a poem has a whole network of connections going outside into the world, into other poems, into people who read it, whatever, into philosophical ideas. This whole external structure that defines what this poem is to no lesser extent than all the internal connections. So, of course, when I was talking about clockwork, I was talking about the inner structure of a poem. And of course, the external, out of the external connections, only some can really be transported in translation. Some can easily, for example, when we're saying that a poem is a sonnet, we're not just saying that it has 14 lines. We're saying that it is a part of a long tradition. It relates to other sonnets, to some more closely, to some less closely. And because there is the same sonnet tradition, or almost the same sonnet tradition, in a different language, you can't transplant those external connections. Biblical allusions is another example. There are, of course, connections that are impossible or very hard to transplant. There are connections, importantly, that can be transplanted, but only when you translate an entire book or an entire poet's oeuvre rather than a single poem. That's why I like translating by the book, like Hughes's Crow, Zabolotsky's columns, things like that.
Talk a little bit about Hughes. You translated it. I think it's a terrific translation. I'm just completely mesmerized by. I only read it a few days ago when you sent it to me. And it came out pretty recently, right? I think it's a remarkable translation. And what a difference between Hughes and Ginsberg that you translated too. It's just two opposites in a way. This barren, bare, after loss, of course, language of Crow in Ted Hughes's case. And by the way, Hughes, who was a translator himself, and if anything, he and Daniel Weisbord started modern poetry translation.
And Weisbord, of course, translated
right, yeah. So it's interesting that everyone we're talking about today, I hoped we'll be talking Hopkins and Hughes, for example. They were not only translators, they pretty much were mentors in translation, and they were enthusiasts of translation as something much more than a literary activity. Hughes's Crow, can you please tell us a little bit about your work about it? We unfortunately don't have as much time as I would love to dedicate to this remarkable work of yours.
So I was talking it's a nice segue. I was talking about the analytical picture of what a poem is. But that's not all that's in my head when I translate, and maybe that's not even the most important thing, because another important component is a completely synthetic, non-analytical, intuitive thing that is the voice of the poet. I have no idea what the voice of the poet is, but I hear it when I'm reading a poem. Or at least when I'm reading a good poem. Well, any poem, I guess. When I'm familiar with the poet personally, when I've heard him or her reading, I can't help hearing their voice very vividly in my head whenever I'm reading their poetry. It's something that probably it's the only thing that comes to me intuitively without thinking. And that helps a lot, of course, because eventually what I want is this voice to start sounding in a different language. But it must be this same voice. And the only way I know if it's the same voice or a different voice is by hearing it in my head. And that's all I can say about it. Interestingly, I probably have this parrot quality in me. My wife says that, Masha says that she can tell the person with whom I'm talking on the phone by my voice, because my voice becomes resembling that person's voice. I was talking about the poet's voice when we were disconnected, and I was saying that sometimes I catch myself inserting little bits of a different voice into a poem I'm translating just because I love it. For example, I inserted a couple of more OBERIU voice into Hopkins. Well, I hope I did it where it was apt or appropriate. So back to Hughes. It was my first experience of a large-scale free verse translation. There are a couple of metrical poems there, but mostly it's free verse. And I was glad to try out my theory about translating free verse, which I've had for a while before when reading Russian translations of English free verse. I'm often appalled by how it is too long. It is much longer and what's the word? Lax. It loses all its energy. And I wanted to apply the same principle as with metrical poetry. Just keep the number of syllables roughly, not necessarily exactly, because it doesn't make sense, but don't allow the lines to grow longer than the English lines. And that worked, I think.
And laxer. Longer and longer and
laxer, yes, of course. Keeping the fat down allows you. It just makes you stand on your toes. I think that's the English expression, right? It doesn't let you off guard. You keep trying to express the meaning economically. I have this law, Manin's law of translation. If your translation comes out longer than the original, that means you're underutilizing the expressive language, the expressive capabilities of the target language. If your translation comes out shorter than the original, that means you're missing out on some of the nuances of the original.
It seems to me, Mitya, I'm sorry to interrupt here, just before I forget. It seems to me that it's not even a matter of length per se. It's a matter of energy. And your translation of Hughes, that's why I'm drawn to work that has energy. It's just me. So maybe to someone else there are other things that would matter more. To me, it has to have this immediacy of the energy that feels alive. And your Hughes is anything but lax. It's just amazing across.
Well, maybe I'm deluding myself. Maybe if you take maybe keeping the length, the line length is not a good recipe for ensuring that you have the energy in the translation.
But it worked.
It works that way for me, yes. And I'm rather proud of the first line of Ginsberg's Howl, because again, it's the same thing. I figured out how to keep it from spreading out.
Also, you said that you sometimes insert other language, other tone, and other voice in speaking of Ginsberg's translation in Kaddish. He and Ginsberg, and therefore you are pretty much juxtaposed to several registers, right? And there is this rhythmic, ritual tone of Kaddish itself, right? That he used, and you changed it because the medium of the Russian language is very different rhythmically but you worked with this, and it's astounding how it comes out in translation. Speaking of voice, of course, Ted Hughes we know his recordings, right? We heard his voice, and to me, it's a little bit softer than when I read it to myself. It sounded more stern than what I heard when I heard his own voice, his own human voice, when he recited his poems. With Hopkins, we cannot hear his voice, obviously. I really don't like when actors read poetry. Sometimes I strongly dislike it, but there is one exception. I think Richard Burton's, have you ever heard his, how he recited the leaden echo and the golden echo? It's just blows you away. And to me, this is quintessential Hopkins. Just like I heard it, beauty, 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 vanishing beauty. And if speaking of this poem, it is a metaphor for translation in a way. I've always heard it. Of course, it was written for a girls' choir and opposes immortal beauty and divine beauty and all these things. But there's so many layers, as it's always the case with Hopkins. And to me, it's also a metaphor of translation. This, our despair, remember this word despair, that echoes in the golden era, despair, which is a more optimistic golden view and sound, which is, it's the two sides of translation, despair and the golden echo of resurrection of the voice. So I would love to talk about Hopkins for hours, because as you know, he holds a very special place in my life. But of course, we don't have all this time. But speaking of voice, to me, preserving the voice, whatever you, in a way that you perceive it, of course, because we all perceive the same voice differently, it is extremely important in his case, because we can talk about rhythm, about sprung rhythm, about rhyming, about graphic, how it looks graphically on the page, about all these things, about complex words, about in stress and escape and selving and everything. But it all comes to this unmistakable Hopkins's voice. And when you first mentioned to me that you translated his poetry, if you remember, I responded with some incredulity, for which I'm deeply sorry, but that was not addressed to you. It was addressed to any attempt at translating Hopkins, because in my world, he is impossible to translate. But as we know, it's an absurd thing. It's an absurd idea of the impossibility of translation, because it's just one view and there are millions of other views. In your wonderful book that you sent to me, E.Vitkovsky is the right, this selected by Hopkins in different various translations by Russian masters, one of whom is you. And I read your commentary, which I think is very, very succinct and very, very interesting. Everybody who's Russian speaking, I strongly recommend to read this book, Hopkins, in translation by several translators, and in E.Vitkovsky by, and it was compiled by Valery Votrin and Evgeny Vitkovsky. You said something that I really, really relate to. In fact, I was very, a little bit even jealous when you said that, because it was my idea that in translation, we have primary things and secondary things. And this all goes to the, this impossibility of translation. There are primary things and there are secondary things. Things that you can sacrifice easily are secondary. And there's certain things that need to be, I don't really like using the word preserve, but keep in some very, very, very sacred way of the sense of this word, yes, and recreate, yes. So, and you said that you gave an interesting example. Say a poet uses a cliche, a romantic cliche, and you come up with this cliche. So it doesn't really matter that what kind of cliche is it. You can come up with a different cliche that is pertinent to this other language, but the very fact of using a cliche is the primary thing that needs to be somehow transferred into the other language. So to me, it's a little bit paradoxical too, because yes, the fact is primary, but the very text that you're translating is sort of secondary. So it's also your sacrifice. That's where you sacrifice, right? The cliche itself, but the very presence of a cliche is very important, and that's primary. So my question to you, of course, prime rhythm and rhymes and his human fate and his faith, everything is obvious when we talk about Hopkins. To you, what was primary? What was the primary thing that you tried to keep and recreate?
The drive. You remember what I said in that essay, that every word has such a great weight in his poetry that he keeps on connecting tissue, on all the syntactic glue. He can't afford having meaningless words in his poems. That to me was the most important thing. You need to, when you're translating, when I was talking about disassembling the clockwork, essentially it means that you need to understand or come up with a theory at least. It doesn't have to be a correct theory, but you have to have some theory of why the poet did it the way that it was done and not some other way. And for the Hopkins convoluted syntax that I had sometimes had a lot of trouble disentangling his sentences just in order to understand what goes where, basically. You can't just recreate it by artificially, arbitrarily scrambling the Russian syntax. No, you need to understand why he did it and do something to achieve a similar effect in Russian, right? And my theory was that first, he tries to minimize the auxiliary words because the space is at premium, and second because he wants to put emphasis, he wants to emphasize some parts by moving them around, and third because he wants to achieve phonetic cohesion, phonetic echoes by moving similar sounding words closer to each other, for example, and things like that. Like in the beginning of "Mortal, my friend." Why "mortal, my friend" rather than "my mortal friend"? Because mortal is such an emphatic word. He wants to put it front and center, and he wants to emphasize it as well by this unconventional place in the sentence. So did I kind of answer the question? Yeah, I think I did.
Yes, but here comes the danger. How do you, of course, we deal with a different language. In English, things that start with words that start with the same letter already kind of hint at alliteration in a way, right? They already tend to cluster. Not in Russian. In Russian, sometimes clusters of letters that you spoke about in your essays recreate this effect. So it all comes to effect or impression, right, on the reader in a way, in the new language, which is very important. But here comes the danger to me, and I have no answer to that either. How do you do it in a way that it doesn't sound like a device? When we read Hopkins, we don't think that we're reading poetry. That's the most, if I were to reduce all the explanations what poetry is, I would reduce it to one thing. When you read a real poem, you forget that you're reading a poem. How do you do it in your translation? How one does it in one's translation. So it doesn't really sound like something that is so organic in the original, in Hopkins's original, is not a device, a literary device that it translated. Hughes, here, Hughes, yeah, that sounds great, yes. So how do we avoid this distance, estranging us from the text? Yes. So this is my question, and it's not a fair question because I have no answer myself, but maybe you have some ideas.
I have a paradoxical non-answer. To me, the premise of your question was a complete surprise. To me, Hopkins is as far from not being a poem as can be. It is a total artifice. It is a beautiful, beautiful, intricate artifice. And I don't translate it so that it doesn't look like a poem. No.
Speaking of how we hear voices, right? See,
exactly. This cloud throws two very different shadows.
And a bluebell, to me, his poem is a bluebell, is that itself. The poem is, Bernschell's book, The Poem Itself. So the poem itself is like bluebells, a bluebell itself, right? It's a thing that is it because of what it does, right? So this is, which is a Hopkins, of course, Don Scotus and Hopkins idea, right? The thing is what it does. And this poem is it to me, because what it does to me as a reader, what it does for me also as a reader. And I completely forget that I'm reading a poem, an art of poetry. That's what I meant. Yes, of course, I understand that I'm not in trance. I'm trance, right? I understand that I'm sitting with a book. Sometimes I even remember where I was reading this or that poem for the first time. But it is the degree of our involvement is enormous in terms of in Hopkins's case. So that's what my question was about. And of course, it's very different with Ginsberg and other things. But speaking of originals, right now you're working on this very important project. You're part of this very important project. We both are, but I'm a much more minor member of the team. Translating, we're compiling with Julia Nemirovskaya and Maria Stepanova and a few other poets. We're compiling a, what would you call it, a body, right? A collection of war poems written now, or remembered now, because some of them were written a few years ago, but somehow became relevant now and were posted on Facebook, for example, now. So that brings us to the question: why is our art why is our conversation even relevant today in May of 2022? We know what kind of fire we're living in. Why is it so relevant now? And how is this work different from work on Hopkins or on Ginsberg or Hughes or even Stepanova? In this case, when you translate poems from Russian and from, I know that you have a few Ukrainian translations, right?
Yeah. So I think that the role of the poet, maybe one of the roles of the poet, but the one that comes to the fore at this time, is to give us language to speak about the unspeakable. There is a lot of unspeakable about this war. I avoid adjectives because they're all too weak. I avoid speaking about this war because I don't have words. I literally don't have words to speak about it. What poets do is give us words to speak about it. And it needs to be said. Of course, journalists also do. Journalists speak in plain words about what is going on. And that's an amazingly difficult job and important. But then you need to make some kind of sense out of it. And that's what poets do. For the past, 2.5 months, I've been only translating poetry of war. Julia, who was the initiator and the main contributor to this Копилка project, amassed
Piggybank for our Anglophone listeners. Piggybank.
Yeah, she collected like 500 pages of poetry written, and that's just in Russian. That's an amazing phenomenon, and of course, there are lots of very touching and poetry that not just touches, it hits, it bruises, it knocks you off your feet. And it can be very hard to translate. Not technically difficult, I mean, but technically it's more or less the same as usual. But it can be very taxing emotionally. And of course, that's a kind of emotional strain that I'm in a way seeking, because I do want to do something about it besides sending money, of course, to help people. But in order to understand and make sense out of what is going on, they have this poetry.
What is your primary versus secondary? When you translate Julia Friedman's poem, or that I read a few days ago, I think you made the translation. I also read Maria Blashtein's wonderful translations of the same poet, different poems. If you were to translate Galina's Orlich's poem, you probably saw them in the Piggybank, or other translations that you've already completed. What was the primary thing that you try to convey, relay intact, as much intact as it is possible.
It's, as always, to me, as always, it is the voice, because it is the individuality of the poet. It is whatever the poet wants to say and is saying, and that's it.
You feel it's like a river, right? Sometimes rivers are flowing in very wide valleys. They can flow, they can meander this way or that way. In this case, it seems like, from what you're saying now, you're comparing it to a rushing stream in a very narrow valley or notch, right? The force is enormous, but you give up your freedom in a way, your translator's freedom in some way, right? In this case,
I never consider the position of a translator, my position as a translator, as a position of freedom. Of course, with so much war poetry being written, I do have a freedom to choose what resonates with me more, because then I'm able better to translate it, of course.
What would you want to translate next? Even if you end up, it's not a binding question. If you end up never translating, but just first name that comes to mind from either language, or from one of the languages that you translate from.
Well, I have started translating Anri Volokhonsky, and I would like to do a book.
It's wonderful. Everything I read that you posted on Facebook by Anri Volokhonsky is wonderful, and I think it's very much you. It's unmistakable Manin's translation, and even the choice. I'm sorry for this word. I have to be careful. The choice of the author is very much you, and I think it's very genuine and very organic. And I, of course, I like OBERIU, all the OBERIU related things that you do. Thank you so much. There are so many things I wanted to ask you about, so maybe we'll have another round sometime in the future. And Boris Draluk said something in his interview recently that why do we even care in the end of the world? Why do we actually do this? Just to make some hours a little bit less dreary. I really like this a little bit lighter view of our work, and any literary work for that matter. Thank you so very much.
Thank you, Ira. It was great talking to you, relaxing and meaningful. Thank you for that meaningful conversation.
Thank you.
And maybe indeed, maybe we can continue at some point.
Absolutely.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.